Premier Danielle Smith believes the province should have more input on judicial appointments.
Alberta's 3 chief justices have issued a rare public statement emphasizing the need for the courts to remain independent from government.
Smith wants changes made to the appointment process at the Alberta Court of King's Bench, the Alberta Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court of Canada.
I wish I could direct the judges, honestly, Chris. The judges get very, very prickly when you criticize them, but boy, the example that you just raised, they deserve the criticism.
Alberta strikes back on Canada. With huge judge move, Ottawa explodes. End judicial appointments. Alberta has officially struck back, and this time the target is the heart of Canada's justice system. A huge judge move has blown open a fight Ottawa never expected, turning a quiet process into a political explosion. The confrontation is raw, aggressive, and already pushing the country toward a dangerous breaking point.
The role of the court is to offer their interpretation of it, but too often I think the court has overstepped and not given the proper deference to the legislatures.
So going back to that letter, it was dated January 23rd, only made public yesterday, outlining the desire for her government to have a bigger say in how judges are chosen in the courts in Alberta as well as in the Supreme Court of Canada.
That January 23rd letter did not arrive with flashing lights or a podium speech. It slipped out quietly, but the message inside it was loud and deliberate. Danielle Smith was not asking Ottawa for a conversation anymore. She was delivering terms.
In Alberta are calling for the province to separate from Canada.
Alberta, she said, would no longer bankroll a judicial appointment system that leaves the province with almost no real say. Buried in the formal language was a blunt threat. No change means no funding. And once that letter became public, it was clear this was never meant to stay quiet for long.
Smith wants to see a special advisory committee created that would consist of 2 people recommended by the province.
Can we please write some provincial rules to tune these judges in and JPs that they can't be releasing people who are a risk to public safety?
The timing made it hit harder. Alberta's courts were already stretched thin, with 3 open seats on the Court of King's Bench. Cases were piling up, delays were growing. At the same time, talk of separation and alienation was already humming in the background. So when Smith chose this moment to draw a line, it felt less like a policy complaint and more like a warning. Alberta was done waiting, done trusting a process it believes has ignored it for years. This was not a negotiation dressed up as reform. It was Alberta saying the patience phase is over.
Smith's comments were made on her radio show on Saturday in response to a call-in question on bail reform.
The Premier in Alberta, Danielle Smith, threatening to withhold funding to support new judicial appointments unless the federal government gives the province a say in who is picked.
What really jolted Ottawa was the leverage. Smith was not floating an idea. She was threatening to pull money from the very system that keeps judges flowing into empty courtrooms. Funding for judicial appointments is not symbolic. It is the grease that keeps the machinery moving. Without it, vacancies vacant, hearings slow down, justice stalls. Smith knew exactly what she was doing when she said Alberta would withhold that support until its demands were met. It turned a constitutional disagreement into a pressure point with real consequences.
I wish I could direct the judges, honestly, Chris. The judges get very, very prickly when you criticize them, but boy, the example that you just raised, they deserve the criticism.
That is when the fight stopped being about judges on paper and started being about control. Who gets to shape the courts? Who gets to decide what voices matter? Ottawa appoints judges across the country, but it does not do it alone. The system runs through 17 judicial advisory committees, each made up of 7 people. Some come from the federal government, some from the province, one from the Chief Justice, others from national and provincial legal groups. On paper, it looks balanced. From Alberta's perspective, it feels crowded and distant.
This isn't the first time Smith has criticized how judges do their jobs. She raised the issue in a year-end interview with a staff member while discussing her government's use of a notwithstanding clause in government bills affecting transgender youth and adults.
Here is the part that fuels the resentment. Alberta has only one of those committees. One table where its interests compete with federal voices and legal organizations that do not answer to voters in the province. Smith argues this arm's-length model may protect independence in theory, but in practice it leaves Alberta diluted. Decisions are filtered, priorities are softened, and by the time a shortlist reaches Ottawa, Alberta believes its influence has already been watered down. To Smith, that is not neutrality, it is exclusion dressed up as procedure.
The province's chief justices issued a rare written statement on Tuesday, posted to the main page of the Alberta Court's website.
So she dropped a blueprint that rattled the legal world. Instead of 7 members, she wants 4. 2 picked by Alberta, 2 by Ottawa. No extra buffers, no layered distance, just a direct balance of power. That smaller group would build the short list of potential judges, which would then go to federal ministers for final approval. Ottawa would still sign off, but only after Alberta reshaped the pool. Critics immediately saw the shift. This was not a small adjustment. It was a structural rewrite that pulled politics closer to the heart of the process.
She says Alberta will withhold funding to support new appointments until its input is allowed. There are currently 3 vacancies on the Alberta Court of King's Bench.
That proximity is exactly what alarms legal experts. They argue advisory committees exist to keep appointments insulated from political pressure. Shrinking them and tying half the seats directly to a provincial government changes the atmosphere completely. Every name on the list would be read through a political lens. Supporters of Smith's plan call that accountability. Opponents call it interference. And once that door opens, it is hard to close again. Smith did not help calm nerves when she went further, openly criticizing how courts operate and suggesting judges should better reflect Alberta's values and traditions. At one point, she even talked about directing judges, a phrase that sent shockwaves through the judiciary. Chief justices pushed back quickly, reminding everyone that courts are meant to be independent, not guided by elected leaders' preferences. The reaction was sharp because the stakes are high. Once political leaders start talking about directing judges, the line between law and power starts to blur.
The justices explained how independence of the courts protect the public and democracy.
The legal community inside Alberta also bristled. When Smith spoke about distinct legal traditions, criminal trial lawyers openly admitted they had no idea what that meant. Many pointed out that Alberta already punches above its weight, having produced more Supreme Court justices than any other province. That fact alone undercut the argument that Alberta is frozen out of the system. For critics, the rhetoric did not match the reality, and that disconnect only intensified the backlash.
The independence of each branch ensures there are checks and balances across the system. It is the foundation of a healthy democracy.
Ottawa's response was swift and defensive. Justice Minister Sean Fraser emphasized that judicial advisory committees are designed to protect independence by keeping appointments at arm's length from politics. The message was clear. This system exists for a reason, and dismantling it risks long-term damage. The NDP added another warning, saying courts are already underfunded and overwhelmed. Cutting funding over a power struggle would not hurt politicians first. It would hurt ordinary people waiting for their day in court.
I don't know whether any of her comments have skated over a line, but you wonder if they're concerned that she skated close to a line.
That is why this fight feels bigger than one letter or one province. It lands in a moment where trust between Alberta and Ottawa is already fragile. To supporters, Smith looks like a leader finally pushing back against a federal system that takes Alberta's cooperation for granted. To critics, she looks like someone playing constitutional chicken with the justice system as collateral. Either way, the fuse has been lit, and the explosion is no longer hypothetical.
Public statement from sitting justices is unusual, but he thinks that Smith might have taken things too far.
Then came the moment where this fight stopped being about committee charts and vacancies and suddenly turned explosive. Language, one word that should be boring, one requirement that usually lives deep in policy manuals. And yet, this is where everything caught fire. Danielle Smith openly questioned the bilingual requirement for judges, and the reaction was instant. She framed it as a practical issue. Alberta, she said, is losing qualified candidates because Ottawa insists judges meet a standard that does not reflect how law is actually practiced in the province. On paper, that sounds procedural. In reality, it hit a nerve.
The notion that the courts have overstepped and not given proper deference to the legislature, that I think is a very respectable argument that we can have a discussion about. And indeed, several law professors have made that argument over the past 40 years.
Because nobody heard that argument as neutral. Critics did not hear efficiency. They heard exclusion. They heard culture wars creeping into the courtroom. What Smith described as a talent pool problem quickly turned into a national argument about identity and power. power. To her supporters, this was Ottawa once again imposing rules designed for Central Canada and calling it fairness. To her opponents, it sounded like a step backward disguised as common sense, something that could quietly reshape who gets access to power in the justice system. A technical requirement suddenly became political dynamite.
In a statement to CBC News, Smith's press secretary says the government respects the role of each branch of government and supports their independence.
That is when the tone shifted from sharp to combustible. Because once language entered the conversation, resentment that had been simmering for years rushed to the surface. Alberta has long bristled at federal standards it feels were designed elsewhere and imposed without real consultation. The bilingual debate tapped straight into that feeling. It stopped being about judges and started sounding like a referendum on whose Canada matters more, and that made everyone dig in harder. Then Smith poured gasoline on it. On Calgary radio, she said something that froze the room. She talked about wanting to direct judges in Alberta. Not guide policy, not reform structures. Direct judges. In one sentence, the debate crossed a line. Chief Justices responded almost immediately, warning that judicial independence was not a suggestion, but a cornerstone of the system. Judges do not take directions from politicians. That is the whole point. Once that wall cracks, the system does not bend, it breaks.
Now, this comes after Premier Danielle Smith said she wished she could direct judges.
The legal community recoiled. This was no longer a philosophical disagreement about process. Lawyers and judges heard alarm bells. Words like power grabbing started circulating. Constitutional red lines were suddenly part of everyday conversation. Even people who sympathized with Alberta's frustrations paused here. Because criticism is one thing, control is another. And Smith's words made it sound like she was willing to blur that boundary. As the backlash grew, Smith tried to reframe the argument again. She said judicial appointees should reflect Alberta's distinct legal traditions and national unity within the province. That phrase landed with a thud. Lawyers asked the obvious question out loud. What does that even mean? Members of the Criminal Trial Lawyers Association did not mince words. They openly admitted they had no idea what made Alberta legally distinct from the rest of the country. Many had studied law in Alberta, practiced there for decades, built entire careers in its courts, and still could not define the distinction Smith was pointing to.
The rules loosening around judicial appointees when it comes to that requirement for them to be bilingual.
Then came the irony that made the argument wobble. Alberta already has more Supreme Court justices than any other province, more influence at the highest level than most Canadians realize. That fact alone made it harder to sell the idea that Alberta is frozen out of the judicial system. The justification started to collapse under its own weight. And once lawyers began poking holes in it publicly, the backlash intensified. This was no longer Ottawa versus Alberta. This was Alberta arguing with itself. Ottawa did not wait long to respond. Justice Minister Sean Fraser issued a firm statement defending the current appointment system. He stressed that advisory committees exist to keep politics out of the courts, not to sideline provinces, but to protect independence. The language shifted immediately. This was not framed as a disagreement anymore. It was framed as a defense. Judicial independence under threat. Constitutional principles at risk. The temperature jumped.
It is the federal government that appoints all judges in courts across the country, but they are given recommendations based on what is said and brought forward to them from 17 judicial advisory committees.
The NDP added another layer of pressure by pointing to something far less abstract: money. Courts are already underfunded. Backlogs are already stretching cases out for months and sometimes years. Withholding funding to force political change would not punish Ottawa first. It would punish people waiting for hearings, families stuck in limbo, victims waiting for closure, accused individuals waiting for trials. The justice system does not pause gracefully. It clogs. And when it clogs, real lives get stuck in the mess. That is when the conversation stopped being theoretical. This was no longer a chess match between governments. The consequences were suddenly personal. Ordinary Albertans would feel the damage long before any politician felt pressure. And that made the threat far more serious.
Right now, of those 17, David, there is one of those judicial advisory committees in Alberta.
All of this unfolded under a larger shadow that nobody could ignore: separatism. Talk of Alberta breaking away has been growing louder, and Smith's move landed right in the middle of that noise. To supporters, this fight over judges looks like Alberta finally standing up to Ottawa's dominance. a province reclaiming authority one institution at a time. To critics, it looks like leveraging national unity for political gain, turning the courts into another battlefield in a much bigger war. And that is why this moment matters. If Ottawa blinks, other provinces will take notes. Demands will multiply, the system will fragment. If Ottawa holds firm, Alberta escalates. Financial pressure, political pressure, public pressure. Either way, the balance of power shifts. Judicial independence stops being an assumption and becomes a live political question. This started with a letter. It has turned into a fault line. Smith has not backed down. Ottawa has not budged. Vacancies remain. Funding threats hang in the air. The noise is getting louder. The only real question left is not who wins. It is what breaks first. And whatever it is, Canada will be dealing with the aftershocks for a long time. A this vote when image appears.